If you've ever heard of the Anglo-Zanzibar War, you probably know it as a piece of bar trivia. Officially clocking in at 38 minutes, it holds the record for the shortest war in human history. But treating this event like a quirky stopwatch record ignores what actually happened that morning. A global empire burned down a palace and killed hundreds of people to crush a nation's sovereignty. To understand those 38 minutes, we have to rewind. Throughout the 19th century, Zanzibar, a cluster of islands off the East African coast, was a remarkably wealthy trading hub. It built its fortune moving ivory, spices, and, most tragically, tens of thousands of chained human beings. But by 1890, the major European powers decided they wanted direct control of the region. Britain and Germany signed a treaty carving up East Africa between themselves. The people of Zanzibar and their neighbors were given zero say in the matter. Zanzibar was placed under British protection. In practice, this meant a specific legal arrangement. The local sultan got to stay in his palace and wear his crown, but he was effectively a manager. If he died, whoever took the throne next had to get explicit approval from London first. This setup created an illusion of independence. It was political theater designed to keep the trade routes running smoothly, and it worked flawlessly, right up until a local ruler decided to test whether the independence was real. For 3 years, a British-approved sultan named Hamad bin Thawani played along perfectly. Then, on the morning of August 25, 1896, Hamad died suddenly. Rumors immediately spread through town that he had been poisoned, and the prime suspect was already moving into the palace. This is Khalid bin Bargash, Hamad's 29-year-old cousin. Within hours of the death, Khalid declared himself the new sultan. He skipped the entire British approval process. The British consul in Zanzibar, Basil Cave, immediately informed Khalid that his rule was a violation of the Protectorate Treaty. Legally, the British viewed him as an illegitimate squatter the second he sat on the throne. Khalid responded by fortifying the palace. He rallied about 3,000 loyal soldiers, civilians, and servants to his side. They armed themselves with a scattering of machine guns and a few antique 17th-century bronze cannons, and aimed them squarely at the harbor. Khalid was playing by the old rules of regional power struggles, gathering men to project strength. He failed to realize that the empire waiting in the harbor didn't care about traditional shows of force and possessed the industrial capacity to obliterate his entire compound. Over the next day, British ships sailed into the harbor under the command of Rear Admiral Harry Rawson. They parked a fleet of heavily armed steel cruisers and gunboats right in front of the Sultan's wooden palace. This strategy is literally where the term gunboat diplomacy comes from. The logic is brutal and efficient. You bypass negotiations entirely by placing overwhelming, highly visible firepower on the opponent's doorstep, letting the weapons make the threat for you. Consul Cave wired London to ask if he had permission to fire on the palace if Khalid refused to leave. The reply he received was a masterclass in cold imperial bureaucracy. You are authorized to adopt whatever measures you may consider necessary. With that blank check in hand, Rawson delivered his final terms. Khalid had to lower his flag, leave the building, and surrender by 9 o'clock the next morning. If he didn't, the fleet would open fire. Witnesses later noted that Zanzibar town, usually buzzing with music and crowds after dark, went dead quiet that night. The local population clearly understood what Khalid didn't. The British weren't bluffing. The morning of August 27th arrived. At 8 o'clock, Khalid sent a messenger to try and negotiate. The British refused. At 8:30, Khalid sent a final reply stating that he would not lower his flag and that he simply did not believe the British would actually shoot. The ultimatum expired at 9 o'clock exactly. 2 minutes later, the signal flag was raised on the British flagship, and the fleet unleashed a synchronized bombardment directly into the palace walls. This historical photograph shows the immediate result. High explosive artillery shredded the wooden architecture, instantly silencing Khalid's antique cannons. In the harbor, the royal yacht made a doomed attempt to fire back. It was ripped apart, leaving its wreckage floating near the shoreline. Somewhere in the chaos of those opening salvos, Khalid slipped out a side door. He fled to the German consulate, completely abandoning the thousands of people who had shown up to defend him. By 9:40, the shelling stopped. The Sultan's flag was down. Nearly 500 Zanzibari soldiers, servants, and civilians were dead or heavily wounded in the crossfire. On the British side, exactly one sailor was injured. Khalid eventually escaped to German East Africa. Back in the ruins of Zanzibar town, the British moved incredibly fast. By that afternoon, they installed a new sultan, Hamoud ben Mohammed, a man who fully grasped whose permission kept him in power. One of Hamoud's very first acts was to formally outlaw slavery across Zanzibar. It was a massive, necessary reform that finally ended a brutal economic system that had defined the region for generations. But it is impossible to separate that progress from the fact that it was dictated at gunpoint by a foreign military. And then came the final, brutal irony. Looking at this historical documentation of the devastation left behind, you can see the sheer scale of the ruins. The British government demanded reparations from the local Zanzibari population to clean it up. The civilians had to pay 300,000 rupees to cover the exact cost of the artillery shells used to bomb their own city. Zanzibar remained a British protectorate for another 67 years after that morning. The overwhelming violence of those 38 minutes successfully cemented decades of colonial subjugation under the guise of protection. The shortest war in recorded history is often told as a joke, but it was exactly how the British Empire was designed to operate. When military and political power is entirely one-sided, and an empire doesn't have to explain itself to anyone, resistance is just a brief, bloody formality.